a lot of African leaders and business people and investors are figuring out what we can do to increase our own productivity, our own resilience, our own...
In 2025, the United States abruptly ended AGOA, the trade deal that had allowed African goods to enter the U.S. market duty-free for over 2 decades. There were no warnings, no transition plans, just harsh tariffs that hit the continent like an ambush. But was this a deliberate attempt to sabotage Africa's rise before it became unstoppable? Did the U.S. fear that African nations were becoming too independent, too powerful for comfort? Let's find out. The world watched for chaos. Instead, it witnessed coordination. In the days following the U.S. tariff shock, a strange calm settled over African capitals. It wasn't the silence of confusion, it was the silence before a calculated response. Behind closed doors, trade ministers, presidents, and finance officials weren't scrambling for American forgiveness. They were sharpening pencils, redrawing trade maps, and reviewing export data with a level of urgency reserved for war. This wasn't the Africa of 20 years ago, fragmented, reactive, and economically tethered to the West like a client state. This was a new Africa, one that had quietly been building alliances, sharing infrastructure plans, and debating regional economic strategies under the radar. For years, the African continental free trade area had existed mostly on paper. But the shock from Washington turned ink into action. The threat wasn't theoretical anymore. It had landed on doorsteps in the form of canceled orders, contract terminations, and thousands of factory layoffs. Lesotho was the first to ring the alarm. The textile industry, which had been nurtured almost entirely for the U.S. market, now faced a 50% tariff wall. This was nothing short of an existential crisis for a nation where 1 in 3 workers depended on garment exports. But what followed wasn't panic, it was planning. Lesotho's trade delegation didn't wait for Washington to call. Instead, they boarded flights to Johannesburg, Windhoek, and Gaborone, initiating emergency consultations with the Southern African Customs Union. At the same time, Mauritius issued internal directives to begin market diversification. The island nation had been exporting apparel and processed seafood under AGOA for years, but now its economic planners dug up old trade proposals with India and reactivated dormant agreements with ASEAN states. Customs officers began streamlining procedures to reroute goods toward eastern ports, while the Ministry of Industry issued a public statement. We will adapt faster than they can isolate us. In Namibia, where meat and mineral exports were slapped with new restrictions, state media took a bold tone. They didn't criticize the US. They didn't cry foul. They told citizens, "No one is coming to save us, we save ourselves." Within a week, regional summits were convened. Not just among politicians, but among industry leaders, export unions, shipping heads, and port authorities. What emerged wasn't just a reaction. It was a long-delayed realization. Africa could no longer afford to organize its economy around someone else's mood swings. South Africa, which bore a 30% hit to its steel and automotive exports, launched a full audit of its US-linked supply chains. The results were damning. Nearly 80% of car parts manufactured for American partners had no backup buyers. Yet rather than downsize, manufacturers began retooling production lines to meet growing demand in the East African market, where vehicle imports had spiked in the last 5 years. The Industrial Development Corporation started offering bridge loans to help smaller suppliers survive the export transition. And then there was Ghana, steady, focused, and quietly strategic. While other nations fought fires, Ghana began planting trees. President John Mahama did not rush to issue a condemnation. Instead, he convened a confidential meeting with his Economic Advisory Council and representatives from the African Union. The objective wasn't to fix the past. It was to use the crisis to build something that didn't depend on the goodwill of Washington, Brussels, or anyone else. Mahama pushed for the immediate implementation of intra-African trade routes, physical ones and digital ones. Within a month, Ghana signed 4 regional logistics agreements and moved forward on a blockchain-based customs platform to track cross-border movement of goods in real time. Meanwhile, in East Africa, Kenya's pivot came with a name: the Trade Independence Agenda. The government ordered a comprehensive review of its export economy and began untying it from Western dependencies, step by step. shipping routes that once defaulted toward Los Angeles or New York were rerouted to new buyers in Abu Dhabi and Guangzhou. Kenya's national airline announced new cargo partnerships with Gulf carriers. Textile factories, which had spent years tailoring for American tastes, began redesigning for Middle Eastern markets, even altering fabric types to suit regional climates and preferences. But it wasn't just the governments. The private sector too showed signs of something new, defiance mixed with discipline. In Zambia, copper exporters formed a union to negotiate collectively with non-Western buyers, seeking better terms and longer contracts. In Senegal, small agribusinesses turned to Pan-African crowdfunding platforms to expand their reach beyond national borders. These weren't the moves of beggars, these were the moves of builders. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. What the West failed to grasp was that Africa had been slowly preparing for a break, even if it hadn't planned for this exact rupture. The infrastructure was not perfect, the policies were not always aligned, but the instinct was there to stop being the supplier for someone else's empire and start being the architect of its own. And while Washington may have expected chaos or concession, what it got instead was silence, followed by a very deliberate sound. The sound of African pens drawing new borders on old trade maps. And this was only the beginning. While African leaders were quietly redrawing their trade maps across the Atlantic, something far more calculated had been unfolding for months behind closed doors. What the public heard in Trump's press conference, the announcement of sweeping tariffs and the sudden end to AGOA, was only the final move. The actual architecture of this economic ambush had been in the works long before, built not just to penalize but to provoke, divide, and control. The core of this new regime wasn't just higher taxes on African exports. It was a tiered system of economic punishment, designed with precision. The tariffs were based on a matrix of three factors: a country's trade surplus with the United States, its refusal to align with American foreign policy, and its increasing ties to China. This wasn't global trade policy, it was economic retaliation dressed as reform. Countries that had dared to diversify away from Washington's orbit were punished the hardest. Lesotho, whose crime was trying to open textile partnerships with India, saw a 50% duty slapped on its garments. Madagascar, which had recently signed a maritime logistics agreement with China, was hit with 47%. Mauritius, which had hosted a BRICS-friendly banking summit just months prior, saw its seafood and apparel exports taxed at 40%. These were not random numbers. They were signals. But the real genius, or cruelty, was in the language used to justify it all. The Trump administration framed these tariffs as reciprocal adjustments, implying fairness. The idea was simple. If African countries taxed U.S. imports, then the U.S. would match it. But here's the twist. Many African countries had historically kept tariffs on American goods low or non-existent, often in good faith, hoping for long-term engagement and investment. The U.S., on the other hand, used reciprocity to retroactively punish behavior it didn't like, even when no actual trade imbalance existed. This was clearest in Nigeria's case. Although Nigeria didn't export huge volumes of goods to the U.S., it had recently canceled several American-backed oil deals in favor of Chinese development loans. The response? A 14% tariff across multiple sectors, including agriculture, textiles, and tech components. Not enough to destroy Nigeria's economy, but enough to remind its leaders who held the keys to the global market. And this is where the deeper intention of the tariffs came into focus. They weren't about correcting the balance of trade. They were about maintaining the balance of power. By destabilizing export sectors in strategic African economies, Washington hoped to accomplish two things. First, to force African countries back to the negotiating table on American terms. Second, to create enough internal pressure, job losses, currency dips, investor panic, that local populations would start demanding their leaders fix relations with the U.S. It was less about economics and more about optics, to make African sovereignty look like a mistake. But the plan had flaws, big ones. For one, the tariff regime underestimated just how fragile U.S.-Africa goodwill already was. AGOA had long been seen by African intellectuals and economists as a Trojan horse, a program that offered access, but only under conditions that served U.S. geopolitical goals. The tariffs confirmed what many had whispered for years. AGOA was never a partnership, it was leverage. Secondly, the structure of the penalties revealed far more than Washington may have intended. In the fine print of the new tariff policy, several African products were spared. Not coincidentally, these were products the U.S. desperately needed: rare earth minerals, uranium, cobalt, and lithium. It was as if the tariffs had a built-in escape hatch: punish Africa's manufacturing and food sectors, but leave the resource pipelines untouched. This duality exposed the deeper contradiction in America's position. The U.S. was willing to suffocate industries that empowered African workers, but not the ones that fed its own technology and defense sectors. It was an old colonial formula wrapped in 21st century policy. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the tariff system was psychological. It was designed to sow distrust between African nations. With each country facing a slightly different penalty, some lighter, some harsher, Washington hoped to spark competition, not coordination. The expectation was that African leaders would begin lobbying privately, cutting side deals, or undercutting each other to restore access, divide and rule, updated for a globalized economy. And yet that's not what happened. Instead of turning on each other, countries began calling each other. Shared pain created shared urgency. African economists who had once competed for donor funding now co-authored papers on local trade alternatives. Port authorities from East and West Africa opened digital communication lines to streamline regional cargo flow. Ministers started discussing unified trade standards for intra-African shipments. The result wasn't chaos. It was coherence. Still, the damage was real. By mid-2025, Africa's export earnings to the U.S. had dropped by over 65%. Jobs were lost. Some sectors, like garment manufacturing in landlocked countries, were gutted entirely. But for many African leaders, this wasn't the end of something. It was the chance to start over without pretending that AGOA had ever been enough. What the U.S. failed to understand was that Africa wasn't afraid of losing a privilege. It was tired of pretending it was one. As the impact of Washington's tariffs echoed through African ports, factory floors, and export councils, it became clear that retaliation wasn't the right word to describe Africa's next move. What emerged wasn't a mirror attack. It was a strategic withdrawal from an old system and a march into a new one. And at the heart of that march was a trade framework that, until then, had lived mostly on conference slides and vision documents. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, officially launched in 2021, AFCFTA had been hailed as Africa's boldest economic integration project in history, promising to unite 54 countries into a single market of 1.4 billion people. But as with many grand continental projects, its early years were marked by bureaucratic slow walks, diplomatic delays, and endless technical consultations. Some nations were hesitant, afraid of losing protective tariffs. Others lacked the infrastructure to support cross-border commerce. It was visionary, yes, but it wasn't urgent. That changed the moment the U.S. slammed the door shut. Suddenly, a continental trade system wasn't just about long-term development. It was about immediate economic survival. And that urgency breathed life into AFCFTA in ways no summit ever could. Across Africa, ministries began dusting off the stalled implementation roadmaps. Regional economic blocs, like ECOWAS, EAC, and SADC, were instructed to fast-track harmonization protocols. Digital trade platforms that had sat in beta for years were greenlit for rollout. Even countries that had previously dragged their feet on ratification, like Eritrea and South Sudan, reopened discussions under mounting pressure from exporters and industry groups. But the most telling shift wasn't in paperwork, it was in infrastructure. In East Africa, the Northern Corridor, long discussed as a critical trade artery, finally received the green light for a full logistics overhaul. From Mombasa to Kampala to Kigali, customs houses were linked into a single digital database for faster clearance. Kenya and Uganda jointly invested in cold chain networks to allow perishable goods like fish, fruit, and pharmaceuticals to flow regionally without needing re-export through Europe. In West Africa, Ghana, Benin, Togo, and Côte d'Ivoire began a customs integration experiment, testing a unified trade window that allowed exporters to submit one document set recognized by 4 countries. It was a radical departure from the paperwork hell that had defined African borders for decades. Port authorities held joint training seminars. Warehouses were retrofitted for transit cargo, and trucks that once waited days at border posts were now passing through in hours. This wasn't just trade liberalization, it was a trade redefinition. Africa had spent years exporting raw materials to faraway markets, gold, cocoa, copper, and cobalt, only to import them back later as refined products, often at 10 times the price. AfCFTA allowed a new model to emerge: regional value chains. Countries no longer needed to compete to sell raw goods abroad. They could now collaborate to turn them into finished products at home and move them across the continent tariff-free. Ghana could ship cocoa to Nigeria, where processing facilities would convert it to powder. That powder could be packaged in Senegal and distributed to supermarkets in Mali and Niger. Every stage kept the wealth inside Africa. Every transaction reinforced sovereignty. And every successful delivery weakened the old idea that Africa's growth had to pass through Western approval. The private sector caught on quickly. In Rwanda, textile producers who once designed clothes for American retailers began opening pop-up stores in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, marketing directly to East African consumers. Nigerian fintech startups began building payment gateways specifically for cross-border AfCFTA transactions, bypassing the SWIFT system entirely. In Botswana, diamond polishers proposed a rotating trade exhibition across SADC capitals to showcase high-value goods made in Africa for Africans. And then there was the symbolism, subtle but powerful. African flags replaced corporate banners at trade expos. Pan-African shipping consortiums were announced, not just to compete with foreign carriers, but to challenge the notion that global trade routes had to orbit Western ports. Even the African Union, so often dismissed as a ceremonial body, began taking on real enforcement roles, tracking tariff compliance, mediating disputes, and publishing transparency reports. None of this erased the structural challenges overnight. Some countries still lacked infrastructure. Others still struggled with corruption or political instability. But what had shifted was the intent. The old mindset of waiting for foreign buyers was gone, replaced by a growing hunger to build something self-sustaining. Because for the first time in a long time, Africa wasn't reacting to a crisis, it was building out of one. And as regional supply chains strengthened, border logistics simplified, and continental trade rules solidified, a quiet truth began to settle in. Africa didn't need to re-enter global trade on Western terms, it was writing its own. So in most parts of the world, economic warfare breaks nations. But in Africa's case, it did something far more unexpected. It awakened them. By the end of 2025, the continent that had once relied on external validation to measure its growth had stopped asking for permission. AGOA, once paraded as the crown jewel of US-Africa economic relations, had been reduced to a footnote. African finance ministers no longer cited it in budgets. Exporters no longer built their business models around it. And most tellingly, ordinary citizens no longer saw it as a symbol of opportunity. It had become a reminder of vulnerability, of how fragile even the most celebrated partnerships could be when they were built on uneven ground. The collapse of that system didn't leave a vacuum. It opened a doorway. African nations began using the crisis not just to diversify trade routes, but to rewrite the very logic of how economic policy was framed. It wasn't just about finding new buyers, it was about finding new definitions of success. For the first time, regional trade conferences weren't focused on how to attract US investors. They were centered on how to build trans-African supply chains, issue pan-African credit instruments, and create sovereign rating systems that didn't depend on Wall Street's approval. The message from African leaders had become crystal clear. Africa would no longer build economies based on what the West might allow. It would build on what Africans could achieve together. And in this new era, the US was no longer seen as the gatekeeper to global prosperity. It was just another player in a world that no longer revolved around its decisions. Other doors had opened: China, India, Brazil, Turkey, the Gulf states. But more importantly, African doors had opened to each other. The continent had realized it didn't need a savior. It needed infrastructure, coordination, and most of all, self-respect. Trump's tariffs didn't destroy Africa's economic future. They clarified its direction. They burned the old rule book, and in doing so, forced the continent to write a new one. Not in reaction, but in resolve. Because when the world's most powerful nation tried to remind Africa of its place, Africa remembered it didn't have one. It had potential. And now, that potential is policy. That policy is powerful. And that power is no longer borrowed, it's owned. Do you think tariffs are still in fashion? If not, why is Trump sticking to them? Let us know in the comment section. Is he scared of Africa becoming independent? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.